There is a certain kind of person you have probably met at least once in your life. Something goes wrong, badly wrong. The kind of wrong that makes everyone else in the room start talking faster, breathing shorter, reaching for their phones in a panic. And this person does not move. Their voice does not rise. Their hands do not shake. They look at the chaos the way a surgeon looks at an open wound, not with fear, but with focus. And somewhere inside you, watching them, a question forms that you have probably never said out loud. What do they know that I don't? Why does the fire that burns everyone else alive seem to simply pass through them? The tempting answer is that they were born this way. That calm is a personality trait, something handed out at birth like eye color or height, and either you got the gene or you didn't. It is a comforting story because it excuses you from having to do anything about it. If calm is genetic, then your racing heart and your spiraling thoughts under pressure are simply who you are, and there is nothing to be done. But that story is false, and it has been proven false again and again. In operating rooms, in trading floors, in cockpits, in combat zones, and in ordinary living rooms during ordinary arguments that suddenly turned extraordinary. Calm under pressure is not a trait. It is a trained response, built from a stack of small, specific, repeatable habits that most people never learn because no one ever taught them, and because the people who possess these habits rarely explain them. Not because they are hiding a secret, but because for them, these habits have become so automatic that they no longer notice they are doing them at all. This is what we are going to take apart, piece by piece. Not vague advice to relax, not empty reassurance that everything will be fine, but the actual architecture of composure, the daily rituals, the physical mechanisms, the mental rehearsals, and the environmental choices that the calmest people you have ever witnessed use, often unconsciously, to keep their mind clear when everyone else's is on fire. Some of these habits will surprise you because they have nothing to do with mindset at all. They live in the body, in the calendar, in the way a person structures their morning long before any crisis ever appears. Because that is the real secret hiding underneath all of this. The people who look calm in the moment of maximum pressure are not doing anything special in that moment. They already did the work, hours, days, sometimes years earlier. By the time the pressure arrives, the outcome has already been decided. If you have ever watched yourself fall apart in a moment that mattered, said the wrong thing in an argument, frozen during a critical decision, felt your whole body flood with panic, while everyone around you seemed to expect you to lead, this is not a character flaw. It is a skill gap, and skill gaps can be closed. What follows are 15 of the hidden habits that separate the people who crumble under extreme pressure from the people who seem to become more clear, more sharp, and more dangerous, exactly when the stakes are highest. Listen closely, because some of these will contradict what you have always assumed calm looks like. Chapter 1. The ritual before the storm. Almost everyone assumes that composure under pressure is something you summon in the moment itself, a kind of willpower you reach for the instant things go wrong. But if you actually study the people who handle chaos the best, surgeons before a difficult operation, pilots before a difficult landing, elite negotiators before walking into a hostage situation, you find something strange. The calm was not created in the crisis. It was manufactured earlier, through a specific, almost ceremonial sequence of actions, performed before the pressure ever arrived. This is the pre-decision ritual, and it is one of the most underestimated tools in the entire architecture of composure. Here is what is actually happening. Your brain, when faced with an unfamiliar, high-stakes situation, treats it as a threat to be evaluated from scratch. It scans for danger, searches for precedent, and when it cannot find enough familiar patterns to work with, it floods your body with stress hormones as a kind of emergency backup plan, in case the thinking part of your brain fails to produce an answer fast enough. This flood feels like panic. Your heart races, your thinking narrows, your hands may even tremble. This is not weakness. It is your nervous system trying to protect you using tools designed for physical danger, not modern complexity. The people who remain calm have found a way to short-circuit this response before it ever fully ignites, and they do it through ritual. A ritual, in this context, is not superstition. It is a repeated sequence of small physical and mental actions performed immediately before a high-pressure event. Actions that signal to the nervous system, "We have been here before, this is familiar, you can stand down." Elite athletes do this constantly. Watch a professional basketball player before a free throw, under playoff pressure. The same 3 bounces of the ball, the same breath, the same fixed point of focus on the rim. It looks like habit, but it is actually a chemical intervention, a way of telling an overactive nervous system that despite the enormous stakes in the arena, this specific physical action has been performed thousands of times before without incident. And therefore there is no need to panic now. You do not need to be an athlete or a surgeon to use this. The habit is available to anyone who is willing to design it deliberately in advance, rather than hoping it will appear naturally in the moment. Before a difficult conversation, before a presentation that could change your career, before a decision you know will have consequences either way, the calmest people build a short, consistent sequence they run through every single time. It might be as simple as a specific way of sitting, a specific breath pattern, a short phrase repeated silently, or even the act of reviewing a short list of facts they have already gathered. The specific ritual matters less than its consistency. What matters is repetition, because repetition is what teaches the nervous system that this particular doorway leads somewhere safe. There is a deeper reason this works, and it has to do with how the brain allocates its limited resources under stress. In a crisis, your working memory, the mental space where you hold and manipulate information in real time, shrinks dramatically. This is why people forget simple things during an argument, why students blank out during exams despite knowing the material, why experienced professionals sometimes make elementary mistakes during a genuine emergency. The brain, under threat, prioritizes speed over accuracy and starts discarding information it considers non-essential. A pre-decision ritual works because it does not require working memory at all. It has already been moved into procedural memory, the same part of the brain responsible for tying your shoes or riding a bicycle. Actions you can perform even when your conscious mind is overwhelmed. This is why a person can appear calm and competent, even while internally they are far from relaxed. Their ritual is running on autopilot, buying their conscious mind the time and space it needs to actually think. Building a ritual like this takes intention. It cannot be invented in the moment of crisis, because, by definition, a ritual only works if it has already been repeated enough times to become automatic. This means the calmest people are not calm by accident during their biggest moments. They are calm because they treated calm as a project, something to be engineered in the quiet, boring days, long before the storm ever arrived. If you want this same advantage, the work begins now, not during your next crisis. Choose a short sequence, physical and mental, that you can realistically repeat before every high-pressure situation you face. And then use it relentlessly, even in situations that do not feel especially stressful, so that by the time real pressure arrives, the sequence is no longer something you are choosing to do. It is simply what your body does next, the way it always has. There is another dimension to this habit that rarely gets discussed, and it concerns the difference between a ritual performed out of anxiety and a ritual performed out of preparation. Some people develop repeated behaviors before stressful events that look similar on the surface. Checking their phone repeatedly, rehearsing worst-case conversations in their head, pacing back and forth. But these behaviors actually increase arousal rather than calming it, because they keep rehearsing the threat itself rather than rehearsing a state of readiness. The distinction matters enormously. A true pre-decision ritual is not about mentally revisiting the danger. It is about physically and mentally stepping into a specific, practiced posture of competence, one that has nothing to do with the content of the crisis at all. This is why so many of the rituals used by genuinely composed people look almost boring from the outside. A specific stretch, a specific object held in the hand, a specific short phrase, because their power comes not from their content, but from their sheer repetition across contexts, stripped of any direct reference to the stakes at hand. Consider how this plays out in professions where failure carries enormous consequences. Surgeons, before stepping into an operating room for a procedure they know carries real risk, often follow an almost identical sequence of physical actions every single time, regardless of how routine or how dangerous the specific operation is expected to be. The consistency itself is the point. By keeping the ritual identical across both routine and high-stakes procedures, the nervous system is denied the opportunity to treat the high-stakes version as fundamentally different, and therefore more dangerous than the routine one. This is a subtle but critical insight. The ritual does not merely calm the nervous system. It actively prevents the nervous system from escalating its threat assessment in the first place. By keeping the external behavioral signal constant, no matter what is actually at stake internally, you can build this into your own life starting today, without waiting for a dramatic crisis to test it. Begin by identifying the moments in your ordinary week that carry even mild tension: a difficult phone call, an uncomfortable email, a meeting where you know disagreement is likely. Attach the same small sequence to each of these moments deliberately, even though none of them are truly high stakes. The goal is not to solve today's minor tension. The goal is repetition, building a groove in your nervous system's response pattern so deep that when the real test eventually arrives, your body finds that groove automatically without needing your conscious mind to search for what to do. This is the quiet, unglamorous training ground where composure is actually built, far away from the spotlight, in the small, forgettable moments nobody else is watching. Chapter 2. The breath that commands the body. Of all the hidden habits that separate calm people from panicked people, none is more physically direct, more immediately available, or more consistently overlooked than the deliberate control of breath. This is not a spiritual claim or a wellness cliché. It is one of the most well-documented mechanisms in all of human physiology. And the people who remain composed under extreme pressure use it constantly, often without ever naming it as a technique at all. Here is the biology behind it, stripped of mysticism. Your breathing is one of the only bodily functions that operates both automatically and under conscious control. Your heart rate, your digestion, your pupil dilation, these happen without your permission. But breath sits in a strange, powerful middle ground. It runs on autopilot when you are not paying attention, and yet the moment you choose to control it, you gain direct access to the part of your nervous system responsible for your stress response. This is not a minor trick. It is a literal control panel wired directly into the body's alarm system, and almost no one is taught how to use it deliberately. When you are frightened, when the stakes are suddenly very high, your breathing becomes short and shallow, drawing mostly from the upper chest. This pattern is not incidental. It is part of the ancient survival mechanism designed to prepare your body to fight or to run, flooding your bloodstream with oxygen quickly in case your muscles need to act within seconds. The problem is that in the modern world, the threats you face rarely require you to sprint or throw a punch. They require you to think clearly, speak precisely, and make a good decision while a room full of people watches you do it. Short, shallow breathing sabotages exactly the mental clarity you need in that moment, because it keeps your nervous system locked in threat mode, narrowing your thinking, spiking your heart rate, and making your voice tighter and less steady. The people who stay calm under pressure have, whether they realize it or not, trained themselves out of this shallow pattern and into something slower and deeper, usually centered in the lower belly rather than the chest. A long, slow inhale through the nose, a brief pause, and an even longer exhale, often twice the length of the inhale. This single adjustment sends a direct signal through the vagus nerve to the brain that the body is not, in fact, in physical danger, and it is safe to shift out of fight or flight and back into a state where clear thinking is possible. This is why you will often see composed people take one visible, deliberate breath before they speak in a tense moment. It is not for show. It is a genuine physiological reset, executed in real time, in full view of everyone watching. What makes this habit hidden rather than obvious is that the calmest people rarely perform it as a dramatic, separate act. They have practiced it so often in low-stakes situations, before meetings, before phone calls, even before opening an email they suspect might be bad news, that by the time a genuine crisis arrives, the breath control is fully integrated into how they naturally respond to tension. It has stopped being a technique they reach for and become simply the way their body reacts to pressure. This is the pattern you will see again and again throughout every habit we discuss. What looks like a personality trait in the moment of crisis is almost always a skill that was rehearsed thousands of times in situations far less dramatic. There is also a compounding effect worth understanding. Each time you consciously slow your breath during a moment of mild stress, you are not only calming yourself in that instant, you are also weakening the automatic link your brain has built between pressure and panic. Over time, with enough repetition, your baseline response to stress genuinely begins to shift. People who practice this consistently report that situations which once triggered a racing heart and a spinning mind begin to feel almost unremarkable, not because the situations became less serious, but because the body no longer interprets them as mortal danger. This is the quiet, unglamorous work behind what looks from the outside like natural, effortless composure. It is neither natural nor effortless. It is breath, trained deliberately, applied consistently, until it becomes invisible. It helps to understand exactly why the exhale carries so much of the power in this technique. Because most people, when they try to calm themselves, focus entirely on the inhale, taking one large gasping breath as though air itself were the missing ingredient. The truth is almost the opposite. It is the extended exhale that does the real physiological work, because it is during exhalation that the vagus nerve exerts its strongest influence on heart rate, slowing it directly. This is why a long, slow breath out, longer than the breath in, produces a noticeably different result than a quick gasp of air followed by an equally quick release. Composed people, whether they have studied this mechanism formally or simply discovered it through years of high-pressure experience, tend to instinctively lengthen their exhale in stressful moments, releasing air slowly through pursed lips or through the nose rather than expelling it all at once. It is a small technical detail, but it is the detail that separates a breath that merely feels like an attempt to calm down from a breath that actually produces the intended physiological effect. There is also a public dimension to breath control that deserves attention, because composure under pressure is very often a performance witnessed by others, and the visible signals a person gives off can either stabilize or destabilize an entire room. A single deliberate breath taken openly, without apology or explanation, before responding to a difficult question, sends a signal to everyone watching that this moment, however tense, is being handled rather than suffered. People unconsciously calibrate their own emotional state to the perceived state of whoever appears to be in control, a process closely related to the emotional contagion discussed elsewhere in this exploration. A leader who visibly slows down in a moment of chaos does not appear weak. They appear anchored, and that appearance of being anchored often does more to stabilize a tense room than any words that follow. This is one of the quieter reasons composed people rise to positions of trust during genuine emergencies. Their physiology alone communicates safety to everyone around them, long before they have said a single reassuring word. Building this skill does not require elaborate practice sessions or special equipment. It requires only consistent, repeated attention paid to something you are already doing every moment of every day. The people who master this habit tend to practice it deliberately during ordinary, low-stakes moments of the day, while waiting in a line, while sitting in traffic, while reading an email that carries a flicker of irritation, gradually building the same automatic association discussed in the previous chapter, until slow, deliberate breathing becomes the nervous system's default response to any rise in tension, rather than a technique that must be consciously remembered and deployed under the worst possible conditions when conscious memory is precisely the resource in shortest supply. Chapter 3. The Diet of Attention. There is a habit shared by almost every consistently composed person that has nothing to do with how they behave during a crisis, and everything to do with what they allow into their mind on an ordinary Tuesday. It concerns what they read, what they watch, what they scroll through, and more importantly, what they deliberately choose not to. Think of it as an information diet. And like any diet, what you consume shapes what your body, or in this case, your mind, is capable of when it truly matters. Most people treat information consumption as a passive activity, something that happens to them rather than something they actively choose. News alerts arrive, notifications buzz, Algorithms serve up an endless stream of outrage, tragedy, and manufactured urgency. And the average mind absorbs all of it without much resistance. The problem is that a mind constantly fed low-grade alarm, conflict, and uncertainty begins to treat alarm, conflict, and uncertainty as the normal baseline of existence. When a genuine high-pressure situation then arrives, that mind has no calm reference point to return to because it has spent months or years marinating in artificial urgency. It cannot tell the difference between a genuine 5-alarm crisis and a headline designed purely to generate a reaction, because it has trained itself to respond to both the same way. The people who remain calm under real pressure tend, quietly and deliberately, to ration their exposure to manufactured urgency. This does not mean they are uninformed or disconnected from the world. Many of them are extremely well informed, often more informed than the people around them who consume information constantly. The difference lies in intention. They choose specific windows of time to take in information, rather than allowing it to interrupt them constantly throughout the day. And they are selective about the sources they trust, favoring depth and accuracy over speed and emotional intensity. This single shift changes the nervous system's baseline dramatically. A mind that is not perpetually primed for alarm has far more capacity left over when an actual emergency requires it. There is a second, less obvious layer to this habit, and it concerns the input of other people's anxiety. Emotions, and stress in particular, are remarkably contagious. Sit next to someone who is panicking, and your own heart rate will often rise to match theirs. A phenomenon researchers call emotional contagion, and it happens largely outside of conscious awareness. The calmest people are often quietly selective about who they allow close to them during high-stakes periods, not out of coldness, but out of a clear-eyed understanding that their own composure is a limited resource, easily eroded by proximity to unmanaged panic. They are not cruel to anxious people. They simply protect their own mental environment, the way a careful gardener protects a fragile plant from frost. Understanding that composure, like anything valuable, requires the right conditions to survive. This habit extends into what might be called mental company as well. The internal voices we allow to narrate our days. Constant complaint, catastrophizing, and cynicism, whether from other people or from our own inner monologue, function exactly like a diet of junk information. They may feel harmless in small doses, but consumed constantly, they lower the threshold at which the mind interprets a situation as dangerous. The composed person is not someone who never feels fear or frustration. They are someone who has learned, through consistent daily choices about what they let in and what they filter out, to keep their baseline low enough that when real pressure arrives, there is still room left to rise to meet it, rather than an already exhausted nervous system with nothing left to give. None of this requires isolation from the world or willful ignorance of real problems. It requires the same kind of discipline you would apply to physical nutrition, an honest accounting of what you are consuming, how much of it is nourishing versus how much of it is simply stimulating, and a willingness to make deliberate choices rather than default ones. The people who look unshakable during genuine crises are, in the quiet, unremarkable hours of their ordinary lives, simply more careful than most about what they feed their minds, understanding that composure under pressure is built invisibly, out of 1,000 small decisions about attention made long before the pressure ever begins. It is worth pausing on the mechanism of the algorithmic feed specifically. because it represents a fundamentally new challenge that earlier generations never had to manage. These systems are not neutral messengers of information. They are optimized, deliberately and relentlessly, to capture and hold attention. And the emotional states most effective at capturing attention happen to be outrage, fear, and anxiety. A feed of this kind does not simply report the world to you. It selects from an almost infinite pool of possible information the specific fragments most likely to activate your stress response, because an activated nervous system is a nervous system that keeps scrolling. The composed person understands this dynamic not as a moral failing of technology, but as a simple mechanical fact to be managed. The same way a person managing their physical health understands that certain foods are engineered to override natural appetite regulation. They do not need to feel outrage at the mechanism. They simply need to recognize it clearly enough to build deliberate boundaries around it, checking information at chosen times rather than allowing the feed to choose the timing for them. There is a further layer to this habit worth naming directly, and it concerns the difference between being informed and being reactive. A person can read a difficult piece of news, absorb its content fully, understand its implications, and then close the article and return to their work with a clear mind. Another person can read the exact same piece of news and carry a low hum of anxious agitation with them for the rest of the day, checking for updates every few minutes, mentally rehearsing worst-case outcomes that have no bearing on anything they can actually influence. The information consumed was identical. The internal response was entirely different. And that difference is trainable. Composed people tend to ask a simple, almost mechanical question after consuming any piece of concerning information. Is there an action available to me right now that this information should inform? If the answer is yes, they take the action and then set the information aside, having extracted its only useful value. If the answer is no, they consciously release it, understanding that continued rumination on something they cannot act upon produces nothing but wasted nervous system capacity that might be needed later for a situation they actually can influence. Chapter 4. Rehearsing disaster before it arrives. There is a strange and counterintuitive habit shared by people who remain unusually composed during crises. And it is this: they spend more time imagining what could go wrong than almost anyone around them. This sounds, on the surface, like a recipe for anxiety. And yet, it produces the opposite effect, because the way they imagine failure is completely different from the way an anxious mind spirals through worst-case scenarios. This structured practice is often called a pre-mortem, and it is one of the most powerful and least understood tools for building genuine composure under pressure. An ordinary anxious thought about the future is vague, repetitive, and unproductive. It circles the same fear over and over. Something might go wrong without ever landing anywhere useful, and it produces nothing but a rising heart rate and a tightening chest. A pre-mortem is structurally different. It is a deliberate, time-boxed exercise in which a person imagines, in specific detail, that the worst outcome has already happened, and then works backward to identify exactly what could have caused it. Instead of a vague fear, it becomes a concrete list. This could fail because of this. This could fail because of that. And once something becomes a specific, nameable possibility, rather than a formless dread, the mind can actually do something productive with it. It can prepare. This is the mechanism that explains why some people seem eerily unshaken when something goes wrong in a high-stakes moment. In many cases, they are not actually surprised at all. They saw this exact failure coming weeks or days earlier, during a quiet moment of deliberate imagination, and they either built a contingency for it or, at the very least, mentally rehearsed how they would respond if it happened. When the feared event finally does occur, their nervous system does not interpret it as a novel, unprecedented threat requiring an emergency response. It interprets it as something familiar, something already partially processed, and the panic response that would normally flood the body simply does not ignite with the same intensity because the brain has, in a very real sense, already been here before, if only in imagination. There is a particular technique embedded within this habit that deserves attention because it flips the ordinary planning process on its head. Rather than starting with a plan and hoping it works, the composed person starts by assuming the plan has already failed, imagining themselves a month into the future, explaining to someone exactly why the entire effort collapsed. This small shift in framing loosens the mind's natural resistance to acknowledging weaknesses. It is far easier and more honest to say, "Here is why this failed," than to say, "Here is what might possibly go wrong with this plan I am emotionally attached to." By working backward from an assumed failure, hidden risks surface far more readily, risks that a purely forward-looking optimist would have missed entirely, right up until the moment they became a real crisis. It is worth being precise about what this habit is not. It is not chronic worry. It is not rumination. It is not lying awake at night replaying every possible catastrophe in an endless, exhausting loop. Those patterns are the opposite of what we are describing, because they are unstructured, repetitive, and produce no action, only distress. A proper pre-mortem is short, deliberate, and time-limited. It is performed once, or perhaps revisited briefly before a major decision point, and then set aside. The output is a concrete list of risks and, wherever possible, a specific response to each one. Once that list exists, the mind is permitted to let the worry go, because worry's only real job was to produce that list in the first place. And once the job is done, continuing to worry serves no further purpose. This habit also produces a subtle but powerful secondary benefit. A person who has already imagined the worst case in vivid, specific detail tends to react to an actual setback with something closer to recognition than shock. Shock is what destabilizes people in a crisis, that jarring sense that reality has suddenly diverged from expectation in a way the mind was not prepared for. Recognition, by contrast, keeps the nervous system anchored. The composed person's internal reaction to disaster is rarely, "This cannot be happening." It is closer to, "This is the scenario I already thought through, and I already know roughly what to do next." That difference, subtle as it sounds, is very often the entire distance between panic and precision. Chapter 5. Engineering the space around you. The final habit in this first stretch of our exploration is perhaps the most physical and the most overlooked, because it has nothing to do with thoughts, breath, or mental rehearsal at all. It concerns the deliberate design of physical environment and the way composed people quietly engineer the spaces they occupy, long before any crisis begins, to reduce the raw sensory load their nervous system has to process at any given moment. Human beings are far more sensitive to environment than most of us like to admit. Clutter, noise, harsh lighting, and physical disorganization do not simply look unpleasant. They actively consume cognitive resources, forcing the brain to process a constant, low-level stream of visual and auditory chaos, even when we believe we have tuned it out. Under normal circumstances, this hidden cost is manageable, an invisible tax paid quietly in the background. But under high pressure, when every available unit of mental bandwidth suddenly matters, that same background tax becomes far more costly, silently competing with the clear thinking a crisis demands. The people who remain composed under extreme pressure are, almost without exception, unusually intentional about the physical spaces they inhabit, particularly the spaces where they know difficult work or difficult decisions are likely to happen. This might look like a workspace kept deliberately sparse, free of unnecessary visual noise, so that during a stressful task, the eyes are not competing for attention between the problem at hand and a cluttered desk. It might look like a consistent physical location reserved specifically for serious thinking, a particular chair, a particular room, so that simply sitting there begins to cue the mind into a focused state before a single thought has even formed. In much the same way, the pre-decision ritual discussed earlier trains the body through repetition. Environment, in this sense, becomes another form of ritual, one that operates on the senses rather than on conscious intention alone. There is also a deliberate management of sound and light that composed people tend to practice, often without labeling it as a technique. Harsh, flickering, or overly bright lighting has a measurable effect on stress hormone levels, as does constant background noise, particularly the unpredictable kind. A notification chime, a conversation in another room, sounds the brain cannot fully predict or control. The composed person tends to reduce these variables wherever possible during high-stakes periods, not out of fussiness, but out of a practical understanding that the nervous system is already going to be asked to do difficult work, and every unnecessary sensory demand removed in advance is one less obstacle standing between them and a clear mind when it matters most. Perhaps the most important element of environmental engineering, though, is the deliberate creation of what might be called a decompression space, a physical location or a short window of time set aside specifically for the nervous system to come back down after intensity, rather than moving directly from one high-pressure event into the next without pause. Most people, especially in demanding professional environments, treat recovery as a luxury to be granted only when time allows, which in practice often means it never happens at all. The composed person treats it instead as a non-negotiable part of the system, understanding that a nervous system given no opportunity to reset after stress will simply carry that residual activation into the next challenge, and the one after that, compounding gradually until composure becomes impossible to sustain, no matter how many other techniques are in place. What makes this habit hidden is precisely its ordinariness. No one is impressed watching someone tidy their desk or dim a light, or step outside for 5 quiet minutes between meetings. It does not look like strength. It does not look like the dramatic, visible composure people imagine when they picture someone thriving under pressure. And yet, taken together with the pre-decision ritual, the trained breath, the disciplined information diet, and the practiced pre-mortem, this quiet, deliberate engineering of physical space forms the invisible scaffolding underneath every visible moment of calm you have ever admired in another person. By the time the crisis arrives and the room is watching, the real work, unglamorous, repetitive, and almost entirely unseen, has already been done. There is a specific, often overlooked element of environmental design worth naming directly, and it concerns the physical objects a person keeps within reach during periods of intense focus. Composed people tend to be unusually deliberate about removing objects that invite fragmentation of attention, silencing or physically relocating phones during critical work, closing unrelated browser tabs before a difficult conversation conducted over video, clearing a desk of unrelated documents before opening the one that actually requires full attention. This is not merely tidiness for its own sake. Each object left within eyesight represents a small, continuous invitation for the mind to drift, a background hum of unfinished business, competing for the same limited attentional resources the crisis at hand requires in full. By physically removing these invitations in advance, the composed person is not relying on willpower to resist distraction in the moment, a resource that tends to be in shortest supply precisely when it is needed most. They are removing the need for willpower altogether by ensuring the environment itself offers nothing left to resist. The principle extends naturally to the people allowed physical proximity during high-stakes work, echoing the earlier discussion of emotional contagion but applied specifically to shared physical space. A chaotic, disorganized environment, inhabited by other people who are themselves visibly stressed, compounds the sensory load discussed throughout this chapter, layering human tension on top of physical clutter. Composed people, wherever they have the authority to do so, tend to quietly shape not only their immediate physical surroundings, but the atmosphere of the teams and rooms they are responsible for, insisting on order, not as a matter of preference, but as a matter of practical necessity. Understanding that a calm room produces calm decisions far more reliably than a chaotic one, regardless of how urgent the underlying problem genuinely is. This is a form of leadership that rarely announces itself, expressed not through words of reassurance, but through the simple, consistent maintenance of an environment that does not add unnecessary noise to an already difficult situation. Finally, it is worth noting that environmental engineering, more than any of the habits discussed so far, tends to be the one most people dismiss as trivial, precisely because its effects are cumulative rather than immediate. A single cluttered desk will not derail a single decision in any dramatic, visible way. But a working life spent inside consistently chaotic, overstimulating environments produces, over months and years, a nervous system that has never had the chance to fully rest, arriving at each new crisis already partially depleted before the crisis has even begun. The composed person's advantage, in this sense, is not that they perform better in the moment of maximum pressure. It is that they arrive at that moment carrying far less accumulated static, having spent the ordinary days protecting the quality of their own attention as carefully as any other person might protect their physical health, understanding correctly that the two are, in the end, not separate things at all. Chapter 6. Naming the Storm. There is a habit so simple it sounds almost too obvious to matter, and yet it is one of the most consistently documented tools used by people who remain composed in moments that would overwhelm almost anyone else. It is the habit of naming exactly what they are feeling, out loud or silently, in specific and accurate language, the instant they notice pressure beginning to build. This might sound like a small act of self-awareness, but the effect it produces inside the brain is anything but small. When an intense emotion arises, fear, anger, panic, the part of the brain most responsible for generating that emotion, a small almond-shaped structure buried deep in the temporal lobe, becomes highly active, flooding the body with stress signals faster than conscious thought can keep up with. Left unchecked, this activation tends to grow, each wave of physical sensation feeding the next, fear producing a racing heart producing more fear, until the entire nervous system is caught in a feedback loop that has nothing left to do with the actual situation and everything to do with the body's own runaway alarm. Composed people have, in most cases without ever studying the underlying neuroscience, discovered a way to interrupt this loop almost immediately, simply by putting language to what they are experiencing. I am feeling afraid right now. I notice my chest is tight. This is anger, and it is rising. The specific words matter less than the act of translating a raw physical sensation into a clear, named concept. This works because naming an emotion activates regions of the prefrontal cortex, the more deliberate, analytical part of the brain, and that activation appears to directly reduce activity in the emotional alarm center responsible for the original surge. In effect, the simple act of language pulls resources away from the reactive, animal part of the brain and redirects them toward the reflective, strategic part, the exact part needed to actually navigate a difficult situation well. This is not a metaphor or a motivational slogan. It is a measurable shift in where the brain's limited resources are being spent, achieved through nothing more elaborate than accurate, honest self-description. What separates the composed person's use of this habit from an ordinary person's occasional attempt at it is precision and honesty. Vague labels do little good. Saying I am stressed carries far less power than saying specifically, I feel a tightness in my throat, and a fear that I am about to be blamed for something. The more precisely the sensation and its likely source are named, the more effectively the analytical brain engages with the experience. Because precision itself is a form of analytical thinking, requiring the observing mind to step slightly outside the emotional reaction rather than being fully consumed by it. This small act of stepping outside, even for a few seconds, is often enough to prevent a spiraling reaction from taking full control of behavior and speech. There is also an important distinction between naming an emotion and suppressing it, one that composed people understand instinctively, even if they have never articulated it formally. Suppression involves pushing a feeling away, pretending it is not present, forcing a calm exterior over a churning interior, and this strategy consistently backfires, producing higher physiological stress, even while the outward appearance seems controlled. Naming does the opposite. It does not deny the feeling or push it away. It acknowledges the feeling fully, gives it a clear and specific shape, and in doing so paradoxically loosens its grip, because emotions that are fully seen and accurately described tend to lose much of the chaotic, overwhelming quality that made them frightening in the first place. This is the counterintuitive heart of the habit. The path to calm is not through refusing to feel the pressure. It is through describing the pressure with more precision than most people ever bother to attempt. Building this into daily life requires nothing more than consistent practice during small moments of friction, well before any major crisis provides a real test. A brief pause during a mildly frustrating conversation to silently note, "This is irritation, and it is rising in my chest," trains the same muscle that will later be called upon during a genuinely high-stakes event. Over time, this becomes less a deliberate technique and more a background habit of mind. A continuous, quiet narration running underneath even the most demanding moments, allowing the composed person to remain in contact with their own internal state without ever being fully swept away by it, watching the storm clearly enough to navigate through it rather than being lost inside it. There is a further refinement of this habit worth understanding, and it concerns the distance a person places between themselves and the emotion once it has been named. Simply saying the words, "I am angry," still places the self at the center of the experience, fused with the feeling as though anger were a fact about identity rather than a temporary passing state. Composed people often go a small step further, framing the observation in language that creates a slight but meaningful separation, noticing that anger is present rather than declaring themselves to be angry. This subtle linguistic shift from "I am this feeling" to "I notice this feeling arising" reinforces the sense that the emotion is a visitor passing through rather than a permanent occupant, and that distinction alone often reduces the felt intensity of the experience considerably, because a visitor, however unwelcome, is far easier to tolerate calmly than an identity. This same principle extends into how composed people speak about their emotional states to others during tense moments. And it is worth noting because it often looks, from the outside, like remarkable restraint. Rather than exclaiming that a situation is a disaster or that they are furious, they tend to describe their internal state with a kind of clinical precision, noting that they are feeling significant frustration and want to address it directly rather than reacting impulsively. This is not emotional suppression dressed up in polite language. It is the same naming habit extended outward, and it tends to have a stabilizing effect not only on the speaker, but on everyone listening. Because precise, non-inflammatory language about difficult emotions rarely escalates a room the way vague, charged exclamations do. In this way, a habit that begins as a private, internal tool for managing one's own nervous system gradually becomes a visible skill of leadership, one that others in a tense room learn to recognize and often unconsciously imitate, simply by watching it modeled consistently under real pressure. It is worth adding a final observation about how this habit tends to develop over a person's life, because it rarely arrives fully formed. Most composed people, when asked directly, will admit that earlier in their lives they were just as prone to being swept away by strong emotion as anyone else, unable to find the words for what they were experiencing until long after the moment had passed, and the damage, whatever form it took, had already been done. The precision so often admired in a moment of crisis was not an inborn gift. It was assembled slowly, conversation by conversation, mistake by mistake, each poorly handled moment of tension becoming, in retrospect, a small lesson in exactly which words might have served better, until an entire private vocabulary of accurate emotional language had quietly accumulated, ready to be drawn upon the next time pressure arrived and clarity was needed most. Chapter 7. Training the body to expect difficulty. There is a physical habit shared by an enormous number of people who handle extreme pressure well. And it involves the deliberate, repeated exposure of the body to controlled discomfort long before any real crisis ever demands it. This might take the form of rigorous physical exercise pushed close to genuine physical limits, brief and intentional exposure to cold, or any other practice that reliably produces a real, measurable stress response inside a safe and controlled setting. On the surface, this looks unrelated to composure in a boardroom or a hospital corridor. Underneath the surface, it is one of the most direct and effective ways to train the nervous system's actual physiological tolerance for stress itself. Here is the mechanism at work. The physical sensations produced by acute stress, a pounding heart, tight breathing, a surge of adrenaline, a flush of heat through the body, are remarkably similar whether the source of that stress is a genuine emergency or a demanding physical challenge deliberately chosen and controlled. The nervous system does not fully distinguish between the two. What it does track carefully and continuously is how the person has historically responded when these sensations arise. If a person has spent years fleeing discomfort the instant it appears, avoiding difficult workouts, avoiding cold, avoiding any physical sensation resembling stress, their nervous system learns a consistent lesson. These sensations mean something is wrong, and the correct response is escape. But a person who has spent years deliberately stepping into these same physical sensations, staying present with them, breathing through them, and continuing to function competently despite them, teaches their nervous system an entirely different lesson. These sensations are uncomfortable, but they are survivable, and they do not require panic. This distinction turns out to matter enormously in genuine crises because the physical experience of extreme pressure, the racing heart, the tight chest, the flush of adrenaline, arrives regardless of preparation. The composed person is not someone whose body fails to produce a stress response. Their heart still races. Their adrenaline still spikes. What differs is their relationship to those sensations once they appear, because their body has repeatedly experienced this exact physiological state before. In a gym, in cold water, during intense physical exertion, and survived it, even performed well within it. The sensations themselves no longer trigger a secondary wave of panic about the panic itself, a compounding spiral that tends to be far more debilitating than the original stress response alone. This habit also builds something psychologists sometimes call self-efficacy under duress, a specific embodied confidence that comes not from believing in oneself abstractly, but from a long accumulated record of concrete evidence that the body can perform, think, and function even while deeply uncomfortable. This kind of confidence is far more durable than motivational self-talk because it is not built on belief alone. It is built on repeated, remembered proof. A person who has pushed through genuine physical difficulty hundreds of times carries into any new crisis a body that already knows, at a level deeper than conscious thought, that discomfort and competence are not mutually exclusive, that it is entirely possible to feel terrible and still perform with precision. It is worth being clear that this habit is not about punishing the body or chasing extremity for its own sake. The goal is controlled, deliberate exposure to real but manageable discomfort, conducted consistently over time, not a single dramatic ordeal undertaken once and never repeated. A short, cold shower taken regularly, A workout pushed slightly past the point of comfort several times a week. A long, demanding hike undertaken not for scenery but for the deliberate physical challenge it presents. What matters is not the specific method, but the consistent, repeated experience of choosing discomfort voluntarily, staying present within it, and completing it successfully, again and again, until the nervous system quietly updates its underlying assumptions about what the body is capable of tolerating without falling apart. There is a specific cognitive skill that gets rehearsed alongside the physical discomfort itself, and it may ultimately matter more than the physical conditioning alone. During any deliberately chosen difficult physical experience, there arrives, reliably, an internal voice urging the person to stop, to quit, to escape the discomfort immediately. Composed people, through repeated exposure, develop a specific, practiced relationship with this internal voice, learning to notice it, acknowledge it, and continue the activity anyway, rather than either suppressing the voice entirely or immediately obeying it. This practiced ability to hear an urgent internal signal demanding immediate escape and to consciously choose a different response is, in essence, a direct rehearsal for exactly what composure under real pressure requires, because a genuine crisis produces that same urgent internal voice, often with even greater intensity, and the person who has practiced coexisting with that voice hundreds of times in controlled settings finds it far less overwhelming when it appears in an uncontrolled one. There is also a physiological adaptation worth understanding, distinct from the psychological training described above. Regular, deliberate exposure to controlled stress appears to produce measurable changes in how quickly the body returns to baseline after a stress response has been triggered, a quality sometimes referred to as physiological recovery speed. A person whose body has been repeatedly trained through voluntary hardship tends to show a faster return to a normal heart rate, normal breathing, and normal hormone levels after a stressful event than a person whose body rarely encounters controlled stress at all. This matters enormously in real crises, because it is rarely the initial spike of stress that causes the most damage. It is the failure to recover afterward, the lingering, elevated heart rate, the continued flood of stress hormones long after the acute danger has passed, that erodes decision-making and leaves a person depleted for whatever challenge comes next. The composed person's advantage, built through years of voluntary physical difficulty, often shows up most clearly, not in how calm they appear during the crisis itself, but in how quickly and completely they recover once it has passed, ready again far sooner than most people would expect. There is one final piece of this habit worth naming, and it concerns the specific timing composed people tend to favor for this kind of deliberate physical challenge. Rather than reserving difficult physical exertion only for days when energy and motivation happen to be high, they tend to build it into their routine on a fixed, non-negotiable schedule, treating it with the same seriousness as any other essential commitment, precisely because the value of the practice lies largely in its consistency. A single difficult workout undertaken occasionally, whenever the mood strikes, produces little lasting change in the nervous system's baseline tolerance for stress. It is the accumulated weight of dozens, then hundreds, of repeated voluntary confrontations with discomfort, spread consistently across months and years, that gradually reshapes a person's relationship with difficulty itself, until the body arrives at each new crisis already carrying a long, quiet history of proof that discomfort, however unwelcome, has never yet been the thing that stopped it from functioning. Chapter 8. The discipline of the next right action. One of the most striking differences between people who fall apart under pressure and people who remain composed within it concerns the size of the problem they allow themselves to think about at any given moment. The panicked mind tends to leap immediately to the full scale of a crisis. Every possible consequence, every branching outcome, every worst-case scenario, all held in awareness simultaneously, which produces a kind of mental paralysis, because no human mind, however capable, can meaningfully process an entire complex crisis all at once. The composed mind, by contrast, has trained itself to deliberately narrow its focus down to a single, immediate, answerable question. What is the next right action? This habit is deceptively simple to describe and remarkably difficult to practice consistently because it requires actively resisting the mind's natural pull toward considering everything at once. When a crisis unfolds, there is an almost magnetic urge to mentally simulate every downstream consequence. What this failure will mean next week, what people will think, what might happen if the next attempt also fails, what the ultimate outcome might eventually become. Each of these thoughts, while occasionally useful in small doses, consumes cognitive resources that are desperately needed in the present moment, and taken together they produce the specific flavor of overwhelm that causes capable people to freeze entirely, unable to take any action because they are attempting to solve the entire future in their head all at once. The composed person has learned, usually through hard experience, to interrupt this expansive spiral with a single, deliberately narrow question, refusing to answer any question larger than it. Not, how will this entire situation resolve? But simply, what is the next single action available to me right now? This might be as small as making one phone call, gathering one piece of missing information, or simply taking one deliberate breath before speaking. The size of the action does not matter nearly as much as its immediacy and its specificity. By repeatedly returning attention to this narrow question whenever the mind begins to expand toward the full, unmanageable scale of the crisis, the composed person effectively breaks an overwhelming problem down into a sequence of small, entirely manageable steps, none of which individually requires the kind of paralyzing mental load that considering the whole crisis at once would demand. There is a particular skill embedded in this habit that deserves attention, and it concerns the willingness to tolerate genuine uncertainty about the larger outcome while still taking confident, immediate action on the smaller one. Many people resist narrowing their focus in this way because it feels, on some level, like abandoning responsibility for the bigger picture, as though refusing to worry about the ultimate outcome is a form of recklessness. But the composed person understands something the anxious person often misses, that worrying about an outcome that cannot yet be influenced does nothing to improve that outcome, and in fact actively depletes the mental resources that would otherwise be available for the immediate action that actually can influence it. The bigger picture is not being ignored. It is simply being addressed indirectly, through a disciplined sequence of well-executed small actions, rather than directly through an anxious attempt to mentally control an outcome that has not yet been determined. This habit becomes especially powerful when practiced consistently enough to become a genuine reflex rather than a conscious technique reached for only in the worst moments. Composed people tend to apply this same narrowing of focus even to relatively minor, daily frustrations, a complicated project, an overwhelming inbox, a difficult conversation looming on the calendar, repeatedly asking themselves the same small question: what is the next right action? Until the habit of narrowing attention becomes as automatic as the breath control and the pre-decision ritual discussed earlier. By the time a genuine crisis arrives, the mind does not need to be taught in the moment how to resist the pull toward overwhelming, expansive thinking. It has already practiced the discipline of staying small and specific hundreds of times before, in situations far less demanding, and that practiced discipline simply continues, uninterrupted, into the moment when it matters most. There is a particular trap this habit protects against that deserves specific attention, because it explains why so many genuinely intelligent, capable people freeze during a crisis, despite having every resource needed to handle it well. The trap is the illusion that more thinking automatically produces more safety, that turning a problem over repeatedly from every conceivable angle is itself a form of productive effort. In calm conditions, this instinct sometimes serves well, allowing thorough consideration of options before a decision must be made. But under acute pressure, with the clock actively running and consequences accumulating with every passing minute, this same instinct becomes actively counterproductive, consuming the exact time and mental bandwidth that could otherwise be spent executing the single next action already identified as necessary. Composed people learn to recognize this trap by its particular emotional signature, a feeling of being busy and engaged, while nothing observable is actually changing about the situation, and they treat that signature as a direct signal to stop analyzing and immediately return to the narrower, more useful question. This discipline also carries a quiet but important benefit for everyone else present during a crisis, not just for the person practicing it. A leader visibly consumed by the entire, overwhelming scope of a problem tends to transmit that same sense of overwhelm to everyone around them, a phenomenon closely tied to the emotional contagion discussed earlier in this exploration. A leader who instead visibly, calmly identifies one small, concrete next step and begins executing it gives everyone else in the room something specific and achievable to organize around as well. Teams facing genuine crises rarely need someone to solve the entire problem alone. They need clear direction about what to do in the next several minutes. And the composed person's habit of narrowing focus down to the next right action often becomes, without any deliberate intention to lead, the exact kind of direction an entire room desperately needs in order to move from paralysis into coordinated, effective motion. It is worth noting, finally, that this habit does not eliminate the larger, more complex problem simply by refusing to look directly at it. The full scope of a crisis still exists, still requires eventual resolution, and still deserves careful strategic thought at some point in the process. What the composed person has learned is simply a matter of sequencing, recognizing that strategic thought about the whole is best conducted in brief, deliberate windows set aside specifically for that purpose, rather than allowed to run continuously in the background during every single moment of active crisis response. By separating the time for broad thinking from the time for narrow execution, rather than attempting to do both simultaneously at every moment, the composed person is able to give each its proper attention, thinking broadly when broad thinking is useful, and narrowing completely when the moment calls for nothing more than the next right action, executed cleanly, one step at a time. Chapter 9. the prepared word. There is a subtle habit shared by people who navigate tense confrontations and high-stakes conversations with unusual steadiness, and it concerns language prepared well in advance of the moment it will actually be needed. Composed people, far more often than most realize, do not improvise their most difficult words in the heat of the moment. They have, through either deliberate practice or long accumulated experience, developed a small set of prepared phrases they can reach for reliably when tension rises. Sentences that buy time, de-escalate conflict, or simply prevent them from saying something rash they would later regret. The reason this matters so much comes back once again to what happens to working memory under acute stress. In a moment of genuine tension, an argument, an accusation, an unexpected challenge in front of an audience, the part of the brain responsible for careful, original language production is often the first casualty of the stress response. Precisely because eloquent, nuanced speech requires exactly the kind of calm, deliberate cognitive processing that intense stress actively suppresses. This is why so many people, otherwise articulate and thoughtful, find themselves fumbling for words, saying something clumsy or overly harsh, or freezing entirely, during the exact moments when clear communication matters most. The composed person sidesteps this vulnerability by removing the need for original composition in the moment altogether, relying instead on a small library of phrases, rehearsed so many times in calmer conditions that they can be retrieved even when the more sophisticated language centers of the brain are compromised by stress. These prepared phrases tend to serve a small number of specific functions, each addressing a particular kind of high-pressure moment. Some create space, a brief sentence that buys a few seconds of thinking time without appearing evasive. Something as simple as acknowledging that a point deserves careful consideration before responding. Others de-escalate rising tension by validating the other person's frustration without necessarily agreeing with their conclusion, a skill that prevents an already difficult conversation from accelerating into something worse. Still, others exist purely as a private, internal script. A short phrase repeated silently to interrupt an emotional spiral before it fully takes hold, functioning almost as an extension of the naming habit discussed earlier, but pre-written rather than improvised in the moment. What distinguishes this habit from mere scripting or inauthentic performance is the amount of genuine thought invested in developing these phrases during calm, reflective moments long before they are ever needed under pressure. Composed people often spend real time after a difficult conversation has gone poorly, reflecting specifically on what they wish they had said instead, refining that language and consciously adding it to their prepared toolkit for future use. Over months and years, this produces a small, well-tested collection of phrases that have been proven, through actual use, to work well under real pressure, each one earning its place through demonstrated effectiveness rather than being invented from scratch and hope to work in the exact moment it matters most. There is a broader principle embedded in this habit that extends well beyond specific phrases, and it concerns the general practice of deciding, in advance and in a calm state, how one intends to behave during future moments of difficulty. This might include a general commitment about tone, a decision never to raise one's voice regardless of provocation, or a specific boundary about what kinds of statements will end a conversation entirely rather than be tolerated further. By making these decisions in advance, during a state of clear thinking, rather than attempting to determine appropriate behavior in the middle of an emotionally charged moment, The composed person removes an entire category of difficult decision-making from the crisis itself, arriving at each tense conversation already knowing, with some clarity, how they intend to conduct themselves, regardless of how the other party behaves. It is worth examining why prepared language works so much better than the alternative many people instinctively reach for instead, which is the attempt to remain composed through sheer effort of will alone, gritting through a difficult conversation while internally struggling to suppress an escalating reaction. This approach tends to fail for a simple reason. Willpower is a finite resource, and it depletes rapidly under sustained stress, meaning that a person relying purely on in-the-moment self-control will often manage the first difficult exchange reasonably well, and then find their composure eroding steadily as the conversation continues, precisely when steadiness matters most. Toward its conclusion, prepared language sidesteps this depletion entirely, because retrieving a rehearsed phrase requires far less cognitive and emotional effort than generating a calm, careful response from scratch under pressure. The composed person is not necessarily exercising more self-control in the moment than anyone else. They have simply moved much of the difficult work of self-control into an earlier, calmer time, when it was far cheaper and easier to do well. This habit also extends into how composed people handle the specific moment just before they are about to say something they might later regret. A skill that might be called the deliberate pause before commitment. Prepared phrases often include, alongside their functional content, an almost physical trigger built into their delivery, a habit of taking a visible breath or briefly looking down before speaking that creates a small buffer of time between the impulse to react and the actual act of speaking. This buffer, often no more than 1 or 2 seconds, is frequently enough to allow a more considered response to replace an impulsive one, not because the person suddenly thinks faster under pressure, but because the prepared phrase and its accompanying pause have already claimed that critical window of time, preventing the impulsive reaction from filling it first. Over years of practice, this buffer becomes so consistent that observers often describe composed people as naturally slow and deliberate speakers, when in fact what they are witnessing is a carefully rehearsed, structural pause, built specifically to protect against exactly the kind of rushed, regrettable reaction that high-pressure moments so reliably tend to produce in everyone else. Chapter 10. The Nightly Return to Zero. The final habit in this second stretch of our exploration concerns what composed people do not during the crisis itself, but afterward, in the quiet hours that follow, when the pressure has passed and the rest of the world has already moved on to the next demand. It is the deliberate, disciplined practice of processing stress before sleep, rather than allowing it to accumulate silently, night after night, until it eventually overwhelms even the most carefully constructed system of habits discussed throughout this exploration. Most people, after a genuinely difficult day, do one of two things. They either continue actively engaging with the source of their stress well into the evening, checking messages, replaying arguments, mentally rehearsing better responses they wish they had given hours earlier, or they attempt to suppress the entire experience through distraction, filling every remaining hour with entertainment or activity specifically designed to avoid thinking about what happened at all. Both approaches, though they look very different on the surface, share a common flaw. Neither actually processes the stress. The first keeps the nervous system actively activated well past the point where activation serves any useful purpose. The second simply postpones the processing to some later, undetermined date, during which the unprocessed stress continues to exist in the body, regardless of how successfully it has been ignored consciously. Composed people tend, instead, to practice something closer to a deliberate nightly return to zero, a brief, consistent ritual conducted specifically to process the events of a difficult day before allowing themselves to fully rest. This might take the form of a short, written reflection, a few sentences capturing what happened, what was learned, and what, if anything, remains genuinely unresolved and requires attention tomorrow. It might take the form of a brief conversation with a trusted person, not to relitigate every detail of the day, but to externalize the experience briefly and then consciously set it down. What matters is not the specific format, but the underlying function, providing the nervous system with a clear, deliberate signal that the day's stress has been acknowledged, considered, and is now, to whatever extent possible, complete. This habit connects directly back to the pre-mortem practice discussed earlier, functioning almost as its mirror image, where the pre-mortem prepares the mind for difficulty that has not yet arrived. The nightly return to zero closes the loop on difficulty that has already passed, ensuring it does not simply linger indefinitely in an unprocessed, half-finished state, consuming background cognitive resources for days or weeks after the actual event has concluded. Composed people understand, whether explicitly or through accumulated experience, that unprocessed stress does not disappear simply because attention has moved elsewhere. It persists, quietly elevating baseline tension, degrading sleep quality, and gradually eroding exactly the reserve of composure that the other habits in this exploration work so carefully to build and protect. There is a final, important element to this habit worth naming directly, and it concerns the deliberate separation between reflection and rumination. Reflection has a clear endpoint. It asks specific questions, extracts whatever lessons are genuinely available, and then consciously concludes, allowing the mind to move toward rest. Rumination has no endpoint at all. It circles the same unresolved feelings repeatedly, without ever producing new insight. And it is precisely this open-ended, repetitive quality that keeps the nervous system activated long into the night, degrading the very sleep that would otherwise allow the body to genuinely recover and prepare for whatever pressure the following day might bring. The composed person, through consistent practice, learns to recognize the difference between the two almost immediately, engaging fully with productive reflection while firmly, deliberately declining the invitation to ruminate further, understanding that the discipline of ending the day cleanly is, in its own quiet way, just as important as any of the more visible habits practiced during the crisis itself. There is a physical dimension to this nightly practice worth naming as well, because the body's recovery from stress is not purely a psychological event, and composed people tend to treat the transition towards sleep with a level of deliberate care that most people reserve only for the beginning of their day. This often includes a conscious effort to avoid re-engaging with the specific sources of the day's stress in the final hour before sleep, closing communication channels that might deliver new, difficult information, dimming artificial light that can interfere with the body's natural preparation for rest, and favoring calm, low stimulation activity over anything likely to reactivate the nervous system just as it is beginning to settle. This is not indulgence or excessive caution. It reflects a clear understanding that sleep itself is one of the most powerful tools available for restoring the very capacity for composure that the following day will demand, and that a person who consistently sacrifices this recovery window in favor of continued engagement with stress is, in effect, quietly dismantling their own reserve of resilience one night at a time, regardless of how many other habits they may otherwise be practicing well. Taken as a whole, this nightly return to zero functions as the closing habit in a complete daily cycle, one that begins with the deliberate rituals, breathing practices, and disciplined attention discussed earlier in this exploration, and ends with an equally deliberate process of releasing whatever the day has demanded before allowing rest to begin. It is easy to overlook this final habit, precisely because its absence does not produce immediate, visible consequences the way panic in a crisis does. Its absence produces something quieter and slower, a gradual accumulation of unprocessed tension that erodes composure not in a single dramatic moment, but across weeks and months, until a person who once handled pressure well finds themselves, without quite understanding why, no longer able to summon the same steadiness they once relied upon. The composed person's advantage, in the end, is rarely a single dramatic skill deployed heroically in a single dramatic moment. It is this entire quiet architecture, practiced daily, protected consistently, and renewed each night, long before the next test of pressure ever arrives. 5 habits are now behind us, each one small on its own, each one easy to dismiss as unremarkable when described in isolation. A ritual before difficulty, a breath lengthened deliberately, a name given honestly to whatever feeling has arisen, a small physical hardship chosen voluntarily and endured, a narrow question asked repeatedly instead of an overwhelming one, considered all at once, a phrase rehearsed calmly so it can be retrieved instantly, a day closed cleanly before sleep begins. None of these, alone, would explain the striking composure of the people you have admired under real pressure. Together, practiced consistently across ordinary days that never once made the news, they begin to form something far more powerful than any single technique could produce on its own. A whole nervous system gradually retrained, day after unremarkable day, to meet difficulty not with panic, but with something close to readiness. Chapter 11. The slow hand in a fast room. There is a physical habit, almost entirely unconscious in the people who practice it best, that has an outsized effect on both their own internal state and the state of everyone watching them during a crisis. It is the deliberate slowing of movement and speech, precisely at the moment when everything in the body is screaming to speed up. Where panic tends to produce quick, jerky motions, rapid speech, and rushed decisions, composure tends to produce the opposite, a visible, almost theatrical deceleration that looks, from the outside, like unnatural confidence, but is, in fact, a trained physical countermeasure against the body's own alarm system. The connection between physical speed and internal state runs in both directions, and this is the part most people never learn. It is intuitive to assume that internal calm produces slow, measured movement, And that is certainly true. What is less intuitive and far more useful is that the reverse is equally true. Deliberately slowing physical movement and speech, even when internal panic is fully present, sends a feedback signal back to the nervous system, suggesting that the situation, whatever it is, does not require the kind of frantic, life or death response the body has begun preparing for. This is not a trick of self-deception. It is a genuine physiological feedback loop. The same mechanism by which forcing a smile can measurably improve mood, applied instead to the pace of physical action under stress. This bidirectional relationship between body and mind runs through nearly every habit examined across this entire exploration. And it is worth pausing to name the underlying principle directly, because understanding it changes how each individual habit should be approached. The nervous system does not distinguish cleanly between cause and effect the way the conscious mind likes to imagine it does. A racing heart can be caused by genuine danger, and a racing heart can also, on its own, generate the subjective experience of fear, even in the complete absence of any actual threat. A slowed, deliberate pace of movement can result from genuine calm. And a slowed, deliberate pace of movement can also, on its own, begin to generate genuine calm, even when it did not exist a moment earlier. This is precisely why the habits explored throughout this journey work as reliably as they do. Not because they require a person to first achieve some idealized internal state before acting calmly, but because deliberately acting calmly, even when it does not yet feel authentic, is itself one of the most direct available paths toward actually becoming calm. Composed people, often without ever articulating this principle explicitly, tend to practice a specific discipline the instant they notice pressure rising, deliberately lowering the volume and pace of their voice, deliberately moving their hands and body with more control than the moment seems to demand, deliberately taking a fraction longer to respond than their racing mind wants to allow. This looks, to everyone watching, like effortless confidence. It is, in fact, closer to a discipline of resistance, actively working against a strong internal pull towards speed. Because that pull, left unchecked, tends to produce exactly the kind of rushed, poorly considered actions that make crises worse rather than better. There is a particularly important application of this habit in the pace of speech, specifically because rushed speech under pressure does more than simply sound anxious. It actively degrades the quality of the thinking happening behind it. Speaking quickly forces the mind to generate words faster than it can fully evaluate them, which is precisely how panicked people end up saying things they immediately regret, promises they cannot keep, blame they did not intend to assign, information shared before it should have been. The composed person's slower pace of speech is not a stylistic choice. It is a structural safeguard, giving the mind slightly more time to evaluate each sentence before it is spoken, catching errors and overreactions before they ever leave the mouth rather than after. This habit also produces a powerful secondary effect on everyone else present, extending the same principle of emotional contagion discussed earlier into the specific domain of physical pace. A room full of people moving quickly and speaking rapidly tends to accelerate collectively, each person's urgency feeding the next, until the entire group is operating at a speed that actively degrades everyone's judgment simultaneously. A single person who deliberately slows their own pace, visibly and consistently, often has a remarkable stabilizing effect, on this collective acceleration, not through any words of reassurance, but simply through the physical example of someone moving as though the situation, however serious, remains fully within human capacity to handle carefully. This is one of the quieter forms of leadership available in any crisis, requiring no authority or title, available to anyone willing to consciously resist the pull towards speed and instead let their hands, their voice, and their pace of movement communicate a steadiness that words alone rarely achieve as convincingly. It is worth understanding precisely why this slowing feels so unnatural to most people the first time they attempt it deliberately. Because the difficulty itself explains why the habit is rare rather than common. Under acute stress, the body is flooded with a specific chemical signal whose entire evolutionary purpose is to prepare for immediate, rapid physical action. Fighting or fleeing a genuine physical threat within seconds, deliberately slowing down in the presence of this chemical signal requires actively working against a very old, very powerful biological program, one that has kept human beings alive for a very long time in situations where speed genuinely was the correct response. This is precisely why the habit cannot simply be understood intellectually and expected to work automatically the first time it is needed. It must be practiced repeatedly in progressively more difficult situations until the deliberate override of this ancient speed impulse becomes itself a trained, reliable response, rather than a theoretical idea attempted for the first time during the worst possible moment to be experimenting with something new. There is a particular training ground composed people often use to build this specific skill, one that does not require an actual crisis to practice within. Ordinary moments of minor frustration, a delayed flight, a dropped call during an important conversation, a mistake discovered just before a deadline, provide ample low-stakes opportunity to practice the deliberate slowing of movement and speech, allowing the skill to be rehearsed dozens of times before it is ever truly tested under conditions that genuinely matter. A person who has spent months consciously slowing their reaction to minor daily frustrations arrives at a genuine crisis already carrying a well-practiced physical habit rather than attempting, for the first time, to override a lifetime of instinct in the single moment when the stakes are highest and the margin for a poorly executed new skill is thinnest. Chapter 12. The counsel sought before it is needed. There is a habit that runs directly against a common but mistaken assumption about what composure under pressure actually looks like. The assumption that the calmest people handle everything alone, relying entirely on their own internal resources without ever needing to lean on anyone else. In reality, the opposite tends to be true. People who remain steady under extreme pressure are, almost without exception, unusually deliberate about building and maintaining a small, trusted network of people they can turn to. And critically, they tend to reach out to this network early, well before a crisis has fully escalated, rather than waiting until they are already overwhelmed. The instinct to handle everything alone under pressure is understandable, and it is also one of the most reliable predictors of eventual collapse. A single mind, however capable, has limited bandwidth, limited perspective, and a strong tendency toward tunnel vision precisely when stakes are highest, focusing intensely on the most immediately threatening aspect of a problem while missing other important considerations entirely. A second perspective, brought in early, often catches exactly what a stressed, narrowed mind has missed. Not because the other person is necessarily smarter, but simply because they are not carrying the same acute stress response, and therefore retain access to the broader, more flexible thinking that pressure has temporarily stolen from the person at the center of the crisis. The specific timing of this habit matters enormously. And it is worth naming directly because it explains why some people's requests for help feel calm and controlled, while others feel like a final, desperate cry after everything has already gone wrong. Composed people tend to reach out at the first genuine sign of difficulty, often while the situation is still manageable, framing the conversation not as an admission of failure, but as a routine part of handling any complex problem well. This early outreach costs very little, in terms of both time and dignity, and it often prevents a manageable problem from ever escalating into an unmanageable one. The person who waits until they are completely overwhelmed before asking for help, by contrast, tends to reach out only when options have already narrowed dramatically, and the resulting conversation, urgent and desperate, does far less good than the same conversation would have accomplished if initiated calmly, days or even hours earlier. Building this habit requires a specific kind of ongoing maintenance that composed people tend to invest in continuously. Not only during moments of active difficulty, they cultivate relationships with a small number of trusted people, often specifically chosen for the particular kind of judgment or expertise each one brings, well before any specific crisis requires calling upon them. This means that when pressure does arrive, there is no need to figure out, in the middle of the emergency, who might be able to help. That question has already been answered in advance. Through the quiet, ongoing work of maintaining real relationships during ordinary times, precisely so that the network is ready and available the instant it becomes necessary, rather than needing to be built from scratch under conditions that make careful relationship building nearly impossible. There is also a particular skill embedded in how composed people frame their requests for help, one that preserves both their own composure and the effectiveness of whatever assistance they receive. Rather than presenting an entire overwhelming situation and hoping the other person will somehow absorb and solve all of it, they tend to arrive with a specific, narrow question, closely related to the discipline of the next right action discussed earlier, asking precisely what input or assistance is needed, rather than simply venting the full scope of their distress. This specificity respects the other person's time and attention, produces far more useful responses, and, perhaps most importantly, forces the person seeking help to clarify their own thinking in the process of formulating the request, often resolving part of the difficulty simply through the act of articulating it clearly enough for someone else to understand. There is a broader cultural pattern worth naming here as well, because it explains why this habit remains rare, even though its benefits are, once explained, fairly obvious. Many environments, professional and personal alike, quietly reward the appearance of total self-sufficiency, treating any request for help as a subtle admission of weakness or inadequacy, particularly for people in positions of visible responsibility or leadership. Composed people have, in most cases through hard experience, come to reject this framing entirely, having learned directly that the alternative, struggling silently and alone until a problem becomes genuinely unmanageable, produces far worse outcomes than the mild discomfort of asking for input early. They have effectively redefined at least in their own private understanding, what strength under pressure actually looks like. Recognizing that the person who reaches out calmly and early is demonstrating a far more sophisticated form of competence than the person who suffers silently until collapse becomes the only remaining option. This redefinition extends into how composed people themselves respond when others come to them for help. And it is worth mentioning because it reveals something important about how these trusted networks are actually built and sustained over time. People who handle requests for assistance with genuine warmth, without judgment, and with real practical usefulness tend to become, naturally and without any deliberate campaigning, the people others turn to first during their own moments of difficulty. This creates a kind of quiet reciprocity across a person's professional and personal relationships, an accumulated reservoir of goodwill built slowly through many small acts of genuine helpfulness offered long before any specific crisis required repayment. The composed person's network, in this sense, is rarely built through explicit transactional effort. It is built simply as a natural byproduct of being, consistently over years, the kind of person others are glad to help when the moment eventually arrives that they need it themselves. Chapter 13. Separating the self from the outcome. There is a subtle but powerful mental habit that runs through nearly every account of extreme composure under pressure, and it concerns the relationship a person maintains between their own sense of identity and the outcome of the situation they are facing. Composed people, through either deliberate practice or hard experience, tend to have separated these two things in a way that most people never manage, allowing them to care intensely about a good outcome while remaining, at the level of core identity, genuinely unthreatened by the possibility of a bad one. This distinction sounds abstract until you observe its absence in someone falling apart under pressure. When a person's sense of self-worth becomes entangled with a specific outcome, when failure in that moment feels not simply like an unfortunate result, but like evidence of some deeper personal inadequacy, the stakes of the situation multiply enormously in the mind, even though nothing about the external circumstances has actually changed. A difficult presentation becomes, internally, a referendum on whether the person is fundamentally competent. A difficult medical procedure becomes, for the surgeon whose identity has fused with their outcomes, a test of whether they are truly worthy of the trust placed in them. This fusion between identity and outcome is precisely what produces the kind of paralyzing, disproportionate fear that degrades performance exactly when performance matters most. Composed people have, through deliberate practice, cultivated a different internal relationship with failure. One where a poor outcome remains genuinely undesirable and worth working hard to avoid, without ever becoming a verdict on their fundamental worth as a person. This is not the same as indifference or a lack of caring. The composed surgeon cares enormously about the outcome of the operation. The composed leader cares enormously about the outcome of the crisis. What differs is that this caring exists alongside a stable, separate sense of identity that does not rise or fall based on any single result, however significant. This stability is precisely what allows clear thinking to continue even when the stakes are extraordinarily high, because the mind is not simultaneously managing both the practical problem at hand and an existential threat to its own sense of worth. This habit is often built, somewhat counterintuitively, through direct and repeated exposure to failure itself, particularly early in a person's development, before the stakes of any individual failure are especially high. A person who experiences enough early failures and survives them with their fundamental sense of self intact gradually learns through direct evidence that failure, however painful, is survivable and does not actually destroy the self, the way early instinct often suggests it will. This accumulated evidence becomes, over time, a kind of psychological bedrock, allowing later, higher stakes failures to be met with the same underlying confidence, not confidence that failure will not happen, but confidence that if it does happen, the self experiencing it will remain fundamentally intact afterward. There is a specific mental practice that composed people often use to actively maintain this separation. In the moment pressure is rising, a brief, silent reminder that the task at hand, however important, is not identical to their own worth as a person. This might take the form of a short internal phrase. Something as simple as acknowledging that this outcome matters but does not define them, repeated quietly whenever the fusion between self and outcome begins to creep back in. Over time, with enough repetition, this separation becomes less something actively maintained through conscious effort and more a stable, background feature of how the person relates to challenge generally, freeing an enormous amount of mental and emotional resource that would otherwise be consumed by existential fear. Resource that can instead be directed fully toward the practical work of handling the situation well. It is worth examining the specific cost this fusion between self and outcome imposes on performance itself, because the damage extends well beyond simple discomfort. When a person's core identity feels genuinely threatened by the possibility of failure, the brain's threat detection systems treat the situation with the same intensity reserved for genuine physical danger, activating the full cascade of stress responses discussed throughout this exploration. The narrowed attention, the flooded working memory, the urge toward hasty action, all of which actively degrade exactly the kind of careful, flexible thinking that difficult situations require. In effect, a person whose identity is fused with outcome enters every high-stakes moment already carrying an unnecessary handicap, fighting not only the external problem but also an internal, self-generated threat that has nothing to do with the actual situation and everything to do with a distorted relationship between performance and self-worth built, in most cases, many years earlier and rarely examined since. This habit also shapes how composed people relate to praise and criticism more broadly, not only in moments of acute pressure but across their ordinary professional and personal lives. Because their sense of worth is not primarily anchored to any single outcome, they tend to receive both success and failure with a similar, relatively even keel, neither inflated excessively by praise nor devastated excessively by criticism. This evenness is often mistaken for arrogance or indifference by people who have not developed the same separation, but it is, in fact, closer to the opposite, a deep and hard-won security that no longer requires external validation to feel intact. This security, cultivated slowly over years, through repeated exposure to both failure and success, survived without lasting damage to the sense of self, becomes one of the quiet, foundational reasons composed people are able to remain so genuinely steady, precisely in the moments when the stakes and the temptation toward fusion between self and outcome are at their absolute highest. Chapter 14. Rehearsing the version that succeeds. Earlier in this exploration, we examined the power of the pre-mortem, the deliberate practice of imagining failure in specific detail before it happens. In order to prepare for it, there is a complementary habit, less discussed but equally important, that composed people also tend to practice, and it involves the deliberate, detailed mental rehearsal of success, imagining not what could go wrong but precisely what competent, successful execution will actually look and feel like, well before the moment arrives to execute it for real. This might sound similar to ordinary positive thinking, the vague, general optimism many people reach for when facing a difficult challenge. But it is structurally quite different, and the difference matters enormously. Vague optimism, simply believing that things will work out, does little to actually improve performance, and in some cases can even undermine it by reducing the sense of urgency needed to prepare properly. The mental rehearsal practiced by composed people is far more specific and concrete, involving a detailed, almost cinematic visualization of the actual sequence of actions required for success, each step imagined in enough sensory detail that the brain begins to treat the rehearsal as genuine practice, building neural pathways remarkably similar to those built through physical repetition of the same actions. This works because of a well-documented feature of how the brain represents action, whether real or imagined. Detailed mental rehearsal of a physical or verbal sequence activates many of the same neural circuits that would be activated by actually performing that sequence, which means that a person who has vividly imagined themselves executing a difficult task successfully many times over arrives at the actual moment of execution with a kind of pre-loaded familiarity, even if they have never physically performed the exact sequence before in reality. This is why elite performers across countless fields, from surgery to public speaking to competitive athletics, spend significant, deliberate time mentally rehearsing successful execution, not as a substitute for physical practice, but as a genuine complement to it, extending the total volume of effective practice well beyond what physical repetition alone could achieve. There is a specific quality to this rehearsal that separates its effective practitioners from those who attempt it casually and find little benefit. The rehearsal must be specific, not general, imagining the precise words that will be spoken, the precise sequence of physical actions that will be taken, rather than a vague, feel-good montage of generalized success. It must also include the anticipated difficulty itself, imagining not a frictionless, easy path to success, but the actual resistance likely to be encountered along the way, and specifically imagining oneself responding to that resistance calmly and effectively. This inclusion of realistic difficulty within the successful rehearsal is what distinguishes it from empty daydreaming, because it prepares the mind not simply for an idealized outcome, but for the genuine texture of the challenge itself, difficulty included, successfully navigated. Composed people also tend to use this rehearsal in the moments immediately preceding a high-pressure event, often as the final stage of the pre-decision ritual discussed earlier in this exploration, briefly closing their eyes or simply pausing to run through a compressed version of successful execution one final time before stepping into the actual moment. This final rehearsal serves a slightly different function than the more extensive rehearsal conducted days or weeks earlier during preparation. It functions primarily as a kind of priming, ensuring that the most recent mental experience the brain has had immediately before real execution begins is one of successful, confident performance rather than whatever anxious, scattered thoughts might otherwise have been occupying the mind in the minutes leading up to a difficult moment. In this way, The composed person ensures that they step into pressure carrying the freshest possible memory of themselves succeeding, even if that memory exists only in careful, deliberate imagination. There is a specific technical element to effective mental rehearsal that separates its genuine practitioners from those who attempt a casual version and find it produces little benefit, and it concerns the perspective from which the rehearsal is conducted. Composed people tend to rehearse success from a first-person perspective, imagining the scene through their own eyes exactly as it would be experienced in the moment, feeling the physical sensations of confident, controlled action rather than watching themselves perform from an external, third-person vantage point. This distinction matters because first-person rehearsal appears to engage the brain's motor and sensory systems far more directly than a detached, observer-style visualization, producing a more genuine rehearsal effect closer to the neural activity of actual physical performance, rather than simply imagining a pleasant outcome from a comfortable emotional distance. This habit also carries an important benefit that extends well beyond the specific moment being rehearsed, and it concerns the general relationship a person develops with future difficulty over time. A person who regularly, deliberately rehearses themselves succeeding under pressure again and again across many different specific challenges gradually builds a broader, more generalized sense of capability that extends beyond any single situation, an accumulated internal library of imagined successful performance that the mind can draw upon. Even when facing an entirely new kind of pressure it has never specifically rehearsed before. This generalized confidence, built through the accumulated practice of vivid, specific, realistic success rehearsal across many different domains, becomes one more quiet layer contributing to the broader architecture of composure. This exploration has traced from its very first chapter a mind that has, through repeated, deliberate imagination, become genuinely familiar with the experience of performing well under exactly the kind of pressure it will eventually be asked to face in reality. Chapter 15. The boring foundation beneath every visible strength. We arrive now at the final habit in this exploration, and it is, fittingly, the least glamorous of them all, the one most easily dismissed, and yet the one that ultimately determines whether every other habit discussed throughout this journey has any real chance of working when it matters most. It is the unremarkable, unglamorous discipline of maintaining a few basic physical foundations: consistent sleep, reasonable nutrition, and regular physical movement, with a level of seriousness most people reserve only for their most visible, most impressive pursuits. It is tempting to imagine that composure under extreme pressure is primarily a mental or psychological achievement, a matter of mindset, willpower, or clever technique. And while the habits explored throughout this journey certainly matter, none of them function reliably inside a body that is chronically exhausted, poorly nourished, and physically depleted. The nervous system responsible for managing stress does not operate independently of the body's basic physical condition. It is deeply, inescapably dependent on it. A person running on insufficient sleep shows measurably reduced capacity in exactly the brain regions responsible for the calm, deliberate thinking this entire exploration has focused on, regardless of how many rituals, breathing techniques, or mental rehearsals they have practiced. Pressure that would be entirely manageable on a well-rested, well-nourished body becomes disproportionately overwhelming on a depleted one, not because the mental habits have failed, but because the physical foundation required to execute them well was never in place to begin with. This is precisely why composed people, despite often appearing to handle enormous pressure with what looks like effortless ease, tend to be remarkably disciplined, almost boringly so, about the basic physical maintenance of their bodies. Consistent sleep, protected as seriously as any important meeting. Regular meals, chosen with at least some attention to how they affect sustained energy and clarity, rather than simply convenience. Regular physical movement, maintained not for aesthetic reasons, but because of its direct, well-documented effect on the body's capacity to regulate stress hormones effectively. None of this looks impressive from the outside. No one admires a person for going to bed at a reasonable hour or eating a balanced meal. And yet, quietly, consistently, this unglamorous foundation is what makes every other habit in this exploration actually functional under real pressure, rather than a nice idea that collapses the moment genuine exhaustion sets in. There is a particular danger worth naming directly, because it tends to catch even capable, disciplined people by surprise. During periods of genuinely high pressure, precisely when these physical foundations matter most, they are also the first things most people abandon. Sacrificing sleep to work longer hours, sacrificing regular meals to save time, sacrificing physical movement because there simply seems to be no time left for it. This instinct is understandable, and it is also almost precisely backward. The moments of greatest pressure are the moments when the physical foundation supporting clear thinking becomes most critical. Not least, and the composed person understands this well enough to protect these basic habits, especially fiercely during exactly the periods when abandoning them would feel most justified, recognizing that a single missed night of sleep during a critical week can undo far more capacity than any amount of additional working hours could ever recover. It is worth being specific about why sleep in particular carries such outsized importance among these foundational habits, because its effects are often underestimated even by people who otherwise take their physical health seriously. During sleep, the brain does not simply rest. It actively processes and consolidates the experiences of the preceding day, and it performs essential maintenance on the very neural systems responsible for emotional regulation and stress response. A single night of significantly reduced sleep produces measurable next-day increases in activity within the brain's threat detection systems, alongside measurable decreases in the prefrontal cortex's ability to regulate that heightened activity, a combination that essentially recreates, through simple sleep deprivation alone, many of the same vulnerabilities to panic and poor decision-making that the other 14 habits in this exploration work so carefully to prevent. This is why composed people tend to treat sleep not as a passive, optional activity to be sacrificed whenever something more urgent arises, but as one of the most direct, evidence-backed interventions available for protecting the very capacity for composure this entire exploration has been examining. The same principle, though somewhat less dramatically, applies to consistent nutrition and regular physical movement. A body running on irregular, poorly timed meals experiences blood sugar fluctuations that directly affect mood stability and cognitive clarity, producing exactly the kind of irritability and mental fog that make sound judgment under pressure far more difficult to access. Regular physical movement, meanwhile, does more than simply build the stress tolerance discussed in the earlier chapter on controlled physical hardship. It also produces direct, immediate effects on mood-regulating brain chemistry, effects well documented enough that physical activity is now recommended as a genuine complement to other approaches for managing anxiety and stress across a wide range of clinical and everyday contexts. None of these three foundational habits, sleep, nutrition, and movement, requires elaborate expertise or expensive resources to maintain. What they require is the same quality that runs through every other habit in this exploration: consistent, unglamorous, daily attention, protected especially carefully, during exactly the periods when it would be easiest and most costly to let it slip. As we close this exploration, it is worth stepping back to see the full architecture these 15 habits have quietly assembled, piece by piece. A ritual before difficulty begins, a breath deliberately slowed, an emotion honestly named, a body trained through voluntary hardship to tolerate discomfort without panic, a mind trained to ask only the next small question rather than the whole overwhelming one. Information and attention carefully rationed rather than passively absorbed. Language rehearsed in advance, so it is ready exactly when eloquence becomes hardest to summon. A day closed cleanly each night rather than left to accumulate unprocessed. Movement and speech deliberately slowed precisely when everything internal urges speed. Trusted counsel sought early rather than desperately late. Identity kept separate from outcome, so failure remains survivable rather than existential. Success rehearsed in vivid, specific detail long before it is required in reality. And beneath every one of these, a foundation of sleep, nourishment, and movement, unglamorous and easily neglected, without which none of the rest can reliably hold. None of this happened by accident in the people you have admired for their composure. It was built deliberately across countless ordinary days that never once made the news, through choices so small and so consistent that they eventually stopped looking like choices at all, and simply became who these people are. That same architecture is available to you, not through any special talent you either possess or lack, but through the same patient, repeated practice that built it in everyone who has ever demonstrated it before you. The storm, when it eventually comes, will not ask whether you are ready, but the work you do now, in the quiet, unremarkable days before it arrives, will answer that question for you long before the storm itself ever does. Perhaps the most important thing to understand, now that all 15 habits have been laid out fully, is that none of them require perfection, and none of them require an all-or-nothing commitment starting today. Composure of this kind is not a switch that flips on suddenly once every habit has been fully mastered. It is a gradual accumulation, built one repeated choice at a time, and it grows in exactly the same incremental, unglamorous way as any other genuine skill. A person who begins practicing even one or two of these habits consistently, choosing perhaps the breath work discussed early on, or the simple discipline of naming emotions honestly as they arise, will begin noticing real, tangible shifts in how pressure feels long before every other habit has been fully integrated. There is no need to wait for some future version of yourself who has everything figured out before beginning. The version of you reading or listening to this right now, exactly as you are, imperfect and still learning, is entirely capable of starting today, with whichever single habit feels most immediately useful, and allowing the rest to accumulate gradually from there. It is worth remembering, too, that every person whose composure you have ever admired from a distance, once stood exactly where you may be standing now, uncertain whether calm under real pressure was something they were simply born without, watching others handle crises with an ease that seemed impossibly out of reach. What separated them, in the end, was not some inborn advantage unavailable to you. It was a decision made quietly and repeated consistently, to treat calm not as a trait to hope for, but as a skill to build. One small, deliberate, unremarkable habit at a time, across all the ordinary days that led up to the extraordinary ones. That decision is available to you as well. Starting now, in whatever ordinary moment you happen to be in, as these words come to an end, long before the next real test of pressure ever has the chance to arrive, and ask what you have quietly prepared.